All right, we're back, and it's COMP391, and it's week 1, lesson 1, part 3. Again, the first part, intro to what we're doing in the course. Second part, we did a little bit of history, which we're going to continue on Friday. And then this part here, we're talking about Blender, a little bit of tools so that you're not bored out of your skull. Listen to me talk about history, right? So let's talk about Blender. So again, you download it from this location, www.blender.org. It's a simple download. It's cross-platform. It does work on Mac, and I'm using it on Mac, Windows, I believe even Linux. When you download and install it, I'm just going to close this off. When you download and install this thing, I'm just going to pull up Blender for myself right now. You get this interface that looks like this. So the main screen here is kind of an intro screen. You can choose not to have this turn on if you want. I don't mind this turning on because it also brings up my recent files that I've kind of put up as well. Clicking away gives you this environment here. And if you notice, there's this grid. I'm going to turn the lights down just so we can see a little bit clearer. My view is going to be a little bit different than your view. So one thing to notice, and again, I have a little bit of glare on my machine, is if you notice there's this kind of a grid, right? Each grid, each piece of the grid is kind of divided into these Blender units. That's what they are. So this little grid right here is one Blender unit by one Blender unit by one Blender unit in 3D, right? If you notice on the bottom left-hand corner, right, which is right here, right here, you see this Y and X and Z, right? It matches these handlebars here that happen in the middle of your interface. The interface is divided into different sections too. We'll talk about that a little bit. It's not a traditional Microsoft type interface, and we'll explain that. Just like Unity isn't. When you first do Unity, one of the biggest challenges of learning Unity or another 3D space is understanding the interface, right? One thing to note, when you select things, selection mode in Blender happens with the right mouse button, not the left mouse button. Just to know that. So if you try and select things, like the object in front of you is pre-selected. If you notice right now, I'm going to zoom in, and you can do that by scrolling your scroll wheel forward and back, right? So I'm going to kind of scroll in here. And if you notice, my perspective remains the same, but I'm scrolling into the object, right? Take a look. There's these three handlebars here, these three arrows. This one moves things up and down in three-dimensional space. I'm using my left mouse button to click here to move this object up and down in three-dimensional space, right? Here, this green arrow, it actually moves up and down, or forward and back in the Y direction. I'm going to just turn it so that way, and by the way, you can turn your view by holding down the middle mouse button and moving your object around, right? So if you actually hold the middle mouse button and kind of drag, it'll drag your view the way you want it, up and down, left and right, and so on. Now, if I was to go from a top-down perspective, if you notice, it becomes like this. The green arrow is this Y coordinate, right, forward and back, and the red arrow goes right and left, right? Let me just go back to this perspective again. So again, if I use the red arrow, here's the red arrow, and again, you can always, if you're confused, on the bottom left, there's this little view that shows the handlebars and which directions they're moving. Okay. Right now we're looking at a cube object, right? Again, what I'm doing is I've got it selected. If I want to deselect it, this is where your shortcut keys come in. You need to press the A button. So let's press the A button. If you notice, it goes from selected mode to deselected mode. Let's try that again. A, and I'm just selecting it. There's if you notice over here in the middle of your viewport here, you have this. When it's selected, it has this orange glow to it, this orange outline. When it's deselected, it does nothing. Okay. So this is our main viewer where we have our 3D perspective. And if you notice on the bottom left-hand corner here, right, this 3D viewport is one of the options you have here. So if I chose something else, for example, if I chose the outliner, my view would now change to this. Right? You can customize any view you like. If I go back to 3D view, it goes back to here. Right? If you ever lose your views or whatever, and if it changes and you're confused and you don't know how to get back, you can always go back to File, New. Let's try File, New, and go back to Reload Startup File. right? And when you do that, it takes us back to the original view, this original file we got back here. One thing to note for Blender in this interface overview, you have a bunch of different kinds of objects. One of them is this mesh, this cube that appears in Blender in the middle of your screen, right? The other one over here on the left is a camera. See this camera right here? I'm right-clicking it to select it. And way in the back there is this light source. So there's three things: camera, object, light source. Okay, cool. I can move any of these objects around in three-dimensional space. The challenge with new people who've never used 3D before is when they move things in three-dimensional space, what does it do to the object? They're not used to the way it feels to move things in three-dimensional space as opposed to 2D, which they're very used to. Okay, and 2D is very flat. 3D, what we see in 3D, but what we see in the computer isn't what we see. Not in the real world, right? It doesn't give us the same depth perception as it does in the real world. So we have this illusion of depth that we're getting from the perspective that we're being shown from the computer graphics, right? So again, let's take a look at this. We're highlighting the object. I'm selecting this object by right-clicking. Okay. I'm zooming in by scrolling in and out with my mouse wheel, right? Okay, one thing to note is these handlebars here, right, is just one way of transforming or translating my object. The other way, if you notice on the bottom here, there's some other controls, right? I can switch it to if you go to the square, it looks like this, right? If I hover over it, it tells me what it is, by the way. The manipulator arm changes from the handlebar look, the arrows, to this. Now, if I pull it one way or the other, it can stretch and squash my object to make it different sizes, right? I can make it bigger or smaller in whatever dimension I want. And I can kind of look around it like this, right? If I move to the other one, right, which is kind of the middle button right here, I'm just going to bring it up. I can also move the viewport up as much as I want. So this is the button that I chose here, right here, right? I can also choose this one, right, the middle one. And if you notice, it brings up this rotation tool that allows me to rotate in a particular axis, right? The yellow axis, or the red axis, right? This is the green axis, right, which is the Y, and then this is the Z axis. So I can rotate the object as well, right? Shortcut keys. Let's go into shortcut keys for all this stuff, right? If I was to go back to my regular manipulator arm that looks like, sorry, I tend to turn it off, that looks like this, the arrows, right? This is the arrow manipulator. I can translate things, I can move things around in different dimensions. If I press the G button, I can move it anywhere I want, my objects, right? If I limit it, I can also constrain my object movement with in any direction, X, Y, or Z, by pressing the additional key. So I can press G and X, and now I'm limited to moving things in the X axis, right? I can use my shortcut keys. If I press Y, now I'm limited to moving in the other axis. If I press Z, I can only go up and down. Use these sub-selection keys, right, with Blender. We make a selection, and then we want to constrain it to a certain direction. We use X, Y, or Z to do that. So if I want to rotate it, and I only want to rotate in the X direction, how would I do that? If you think about it logically, it's going to be the R key for rotate. And if I want to rotate in the X direction, it's the X key. And now I can only rotate around the X coordinate, right, in three-dimensional space. Constraints are really super important because it allows us to get this limited view of what we want when we manipulate our object. One thing I'm missing, because I'm using a Mac, is this numpad, right? Luckily, I have a numpad that I could switch on. I eventually will connect to my Mac with Bluetooth, right? And I can use this as well. One thing that the numpad allows you to do, which I also want you to learn, if you press 0 on your numpad, press 0, it goes into camera mode like this. Kind of toggles in and out of camera mode. So wherever the camera is pointed, it gives us a view of what the camera is looking at. We'll talk about the camera later on. For now, that's one thing it does. The 1 key, right, gives us a view from the front. So this is, if you notice, it says front perspective. If I want to get a flat orthographic feel to things, I press the 5 key, and it gives me a very flat ortho look to it, right? That's from the front. If I want a top-down view, I press the 7 key, right? And this is what it looks like from top-down view, right? So I can actually separate them. If I press the 3 key, I get the right perspective, right, front, top, right, or camera view. If I want to go back into perspective mode, right, my user perspective mode, I press the 5 key, it gets me back in perspective mode, and then I can drag it around like normal. Navigation around Blender is what we're talking about here right now. We need to know how to navigate around the interface in order for us to use the interface, right? Again, highlights, right-clicking selects, left-clicking moves things around. You can drag and drop with your left mouse button, all that kind of stuff. But the right mouse button is the way we select and deselect objects and pieces of the mesh. Let's start a new one. Let's go to File, New, and press Startup File again. Okay, cool. I want to kind of zoom in here again, so I'm zooming into the object. All right, this is cool. On the left, there's different kinds of sidebar. The left sidebar, if you notice, actually allows me to do the same thing I did with my keys and these buttons down here. It actually gives me these other options: translate, rotate, and scale. Right? You can do the same thing up here, and they actually give you the shortcut key if you forget what it is up here: G, R, and S. Right? Those are the 3 shortcut keys. I could also duplicate. Well, what would duplicate be? D. Right? If I press Shift D, I can duplicate my object. Right? I can constrain it if I want it to move around in one axis. For example, on the x-axis, I can duplicate it, right? If I want to duplicate it on the y-axis, right, I can do that as well. So I can press Shift-D, right, and press the y-axis, and I can duplicate it on the y-axis. I can right-click to select, and then Shift-D and duplicate it on the z-axis, right? So I can kind of put them in perspective exactly where I want them, okay? Again, this is an important aspect of navigation, and we still haven't, we're only manipulating things. We haven't started designing anything, right? We have to switch modes for that, which we'll get to. Okay. Questions so far? Anyone have any issues doing things that I'm doing? You're going to have to help me. So for people who are volunteering, when we hit the high school students, when I start doing this kind of stuff that I'm doing right now, I'll do almost the exact same little demo with them. We have a couple hours though, instead of like, unlimited time, and they're going to need to produce something at the end. Okay, cool. So we got this little thing here, and you can manipulate objects. Let's go back, and I want to erase my object or delete an object. I can do that with the X button. If you actually hover over the delete key over here, it tells you if you press delete here or the X button, it can delete each of the objects one by one, right? Until first of all, right click to select, X to delete. I highly recommend you do it, by the way, instead of watching. I highly recommend you try it out because you're going to need to do Blender. Blender is part of the curriculum, and if you don't do it, it'll just slow you down when it comes to the tests. I highly recommend you practice, because when it comes to test time, some of the things I'm going to ask you to do, you're going to have to do in a shortened time frame, and you won't be able to do that if you don't know Blender. Questions so far? So I've deleted everything from here. How do I go back? How do I get my stuff back? What do I do? Huh? Control Z? I could kind of undo, and get them all back. That works just like any other thing. I could also start off a new file, like going File, New. I could do that as well, right? And start off with this again, right? The right side, so this is the left kind of sub-panel, if you will. There's other things you can do here as well. We're going to talk about these step by step. But a lot of Blender's controls and a lot of Unity's controls are hidden. You have to know the shortcut keys. You need to know where on the interface to touch the controls in order for you to manipulate things in three-dimensional space. And we'll go more and more into it as we go. There's no way you could learn it in one day. Even in our little workshop we're going to do for the high school students, Senator O'Connor, they might say, "Wow, that's cool," right? And it'll be like scratching the surface like we're doing right now. All right, Like this is like really truly scratching the surface of what Blender can do. All right, let us talk about the right side. The right side produces an outline for us. If you notice on the right top corner, there's a little outline. This outliner tells us all the objects in our world, right? One of them is a lamp. If I actually left click on this object, it highlights the lamp. It's another way of selecting, right? I can left click the cube and it highlights a cube. I can rename the cube. Rename it to Tom. My cube's name is Tom, right? I can highlight the lamp and I can change the lamp. We're going to talk about lamps in a second as well. And here's the camera, and I can also select the world. Everything that I select here is everything I create in my scene, right, is right here inside of my outliner. Okay, cool. The other thing to note is this. I have a bunch of container views that are right in here. If you notice, if I click on these different layers, right, here's different layers, I can switch to different containers, and if you notice, all my objects are gone. Well, they're not really gone, they're just not visible, right? And I can go from a visible layer to another layer by switching these options right here. So again, things I see on my screen are in my visible layer. Right now I'm in user perspective, which is in 3D. I can switch perspectives by using my numpad. Which button do I need to press to go to top view? 7. How do I go into from perspective view to ortho mode? 5, right? And I can, if you notice now, it's very flat. Take a look. It looks almost like 2D. In fact, it is, right? I have this. It looks like a 2D screen, but really, once I start rotating, it goes right back into this user perspective mode and pops out into 3D, right? It's just another view. It's important for us to know how to go into ortho mode from a design perspective when we start doing actually, creating meshes and so on, because we need that kind of level of detail to go into. We need to constrain ourselves from one perspective sometimes in order for us to mold our meshes around. The right side, this right side panel also has additional tools and controls on the right hand. I'm just going to pull it out. If you notice, there is the render. If I click the render button, what it does is it tries to render this object that I see in 3D. And it's rendering it according to the camera angle. I just press this button right here, render, right? I'm rendering my active scene, and it's rendering it with the current texture that's been applied to the object, as well as the current lighting and shadows. If I go to the next one, it talks about the render layer. I can render different layers different ways. We'll skip that for now, right? I'm going to keep skipping until I get to world mode. World mode, actually what it does is this button right here, it actually allows me to manipulate the background of the world and how the world works, how the sky looks in the background and so on. We'll get into that as well. The middle one actually talks about physically transforming my object. I can actually number transform my object by using these controls here, right, in Blender units. And I can actually convert these Blender units into meters and feet if I want to be very accurate when I create my objects in 3D space, right? I'm going to skip the link button for now. It's a constraint, that's what it is. And I'm going to go over here to the camera view, right? This camera shows me my camera's perspective. If you notice, my start is at 0.1 Blender units, and my distance, my maximum distance is 100 Blender units, which means anything beyond 100 Blender units it kind of fades out into a mist, right? Sometimes we want that in a game, sometimes we don't. We want to be able to see far away, right? So this camera mode, if you look at the number of Blender units we can see, our visibility only goes 100 Blender units deep right now, which is not that great. It's still pretty cool for what we can do, but not that far.
I don't have a camera mode there.
All I'm doing is clicking through here. That's all I'm doing.
Yeah,
the reason why is because if you look at render, I clicked on render, and now I'm just going to keep clicking through. All I'm doing is clicking right through.
Yeah, I don't have those same buttons.
You may not. My version, again, I'm using a Mac, so there might be slight changes compared to what you see. But my 2.74 is almost like your 2.74. How about this texture view? You see texture view?
Yes.
Right. These are the textures you can create, right? And by the way, I'm going to press escape. When I press escape, I kind of get back to user perspective mode. Right now I don't have a texture. We'll talk about that. And on the right hand, I can create something called a force field and a rigid body constraint if I want to constrain my body, if I want to make it move I can put in some bones and so on. We're not going to do that right now. So this controls these panels all over the place, allow us different kinds of controls. This is the default way it kind of looks like this. You can also, on the top here where it says default, right, there's different kinds of views you can shift into. For example, there's 3D view full, which changes the 3D view, right? You can go back into animation view if there's kind of an animation. It gives you additional controls and panels that are hidden, right? And you can also go into compositing mode, which allows us to when we composite textures and we unwrap textures on our object, we can do so better in compositing mode, and so on. And we can go back into default mode, and you can also create your own by clicking the plus button. I recommend if you're going to make your own mode, click the plus button so you always can go back to default mode before you manipulate everything. So if I click the plus button right now, it'll create another default mode, default 001, which I can simply rename, to whatever I want, like Tom. Here's Tom mode, right? Now if I do anything, like for example, if you pick this right corner here in my interface and I move it across, I can have two views of the same interface. Or I can have three views. I can cut my view as many times as I want, and depending on which way I want to look at it, like for example right now everything is in the same user perspective. But what if I want to have top, left, and right mode in different windows? I can do that. So I can make this one here. By hovering over the different windows with my mouse, I almost like create focus. I put focus to these windows, right? So here I am in this window on the left, and all I've done, by the way, to create this stuff is just I've grabbed the left and pulled it down, right? Okay, so here I am with this window here, and you know what? If I want to get rid of this sidebar, I can press the T button. T button takes the sidebar away. Same thing with these ones and this one. I can take all the sidebars away with pressing the T button. If I want them back, I just press T again, and it toggles back in, right? So here I go. So I want to create my top-down kind of view from here. I click my 7 button and my 5 button, right? And if I kind of hover over this one, the top right one, maybe I want to go with my right perspective here. So right, and then the 5 button, right? That's the right mode. And here on the bottom, I want to go from my front, right? So here's my front, and again, I want to go into ortho mode. So you can see I can manipulate things on all three views, and it's the same object. Right? So if I right-click on this object here, all the objects are right-clicked. And if I move things from a top-down view like this, then they all move, right? According to the view that I'm looking at. So very, very powerful and very flexible views that Blender allows you to do to manipulate your objects, right? If you notice here, I just named this perspective Tom. I'm going to go back to default view. I saved default view. I didn't kill default view. And now I'm back to my default view. That's why I recommend don't kill your default view, guys. Don't do it, right? Create your own view, save it, whatever you want to do, and then you can always go back to this default view just to get back to this, to normalcy. This is almost like my home base, right? All right, so that's Blender's navigation and user interface in a nutshell. If you notice, there's also menus on the top for the file menu, the rendering menu, and so on, depending on which mode I'm in and which button I've selected. These menus are all context sensitive. There's also menus down here. These menus down here actually I use a lot because this menu down here in this level, right? Here, this menu right here, it really concerns what's going on in here. This menu up here doesn't always concern what's going on here. This is more like the application menu, and here this is more like the object menu, the one I'm looking at right now. So some really cool options in here in this menu that are different from the menus up here. Okay, so be advised that there's like lots of layers and lots of controls that are hidden and layered on top of each other in Blender, right? Actually, we do that in other applications that Microsoft has as well. They just do it where one control is layered over another, and they have that little button that kind of shows an ellipses that says, hey, there's something else that you can click in here. Even in Photoshop or whatever, you have 5, 6 controls layered on top of each other, and you have a default control that you can immediately look at. There's also this other window down here. This other window, this is the animation timeline. Actually, Blender has this built in. We're going to learn about animation, how to create keyframes. Who's ever done Flash? Right? You may have not. Very similar to Flash, but instead of doing it in 2D, I can do it in 3D. Create keyframes, keyframe animation by taking a snapshot of my current position of my object, creating a snapshot of somewhere down the line, a different frame, and then animating it from one frame to the next very smoothly. And you can create your you know, an ease in and an ease out effect with no coding. Everything is done like this. One thing to note before we move on to actual editing and doing stuff, exploring how we can manipulate this further, is this. On the top, if you notice on the top, we're right now in Blender render mode. There's different modes. By default, Blender comes with the following: Blender render, Blender game, and cycles render, right? Blender render is almost like this simple rendering mode that I talked about before. Now the good thing is this: Blender render and Blender game are compatible, right? So if you do something in Blender render and you want to move from into the game engine, which is Blender game, they're compatible. Blender cycles render is not compatible with game at all, right? Cycles render is really cool to create a scene, to create a static object or something else. Cycles render does that. To create a simulation, right? Those things you do in cycles render. It is a different rendering mode. It does different texturing, different lighting, different everything. We will be touching upon cycles rendering, but mostly we'll be focusing on these two rendering modes right here: Blender render and Blender game. Right? Just in case. You might see some tutorials out there that says, let's use cycle rendering. It's a totally different rendering mode than what we're doing right now. And why? Because they composite the textures and everything else, the lighting and the shadowing a lot differently than we do it now. Let's move into Blender game. Let's move into Blender game for a second. One thing to note is when you move into Blender game, you have the ability to actually play the game. If I press the P button now, right, I'm in game mode, right? Oh, I can't do anything right now because I haven't programmed anything, right? If I press the escape button, I'm back out of game mode, right? P, play, escape, out, right? Sometimes I need the other panel that's missing here, almost like a numeric panel that I can access by pressing the N button. Let's press the N button. And the N button, what it does, it gives us an additional context, a context menu according to what's selected in the middle and according to what mode we're in. Right now we're in Blender game mode, so it's going to give us a different option on the right here. And again, you can see numeric transforms for my object. So if I want to go in here in my X location and I want to change this to one Blender unit, right, and press Enter, it actually moves it in the X direction by one Blender unit, right? You can also lock different controls, lock down, especially from a rotation perspective. If I want to rotate across the x-axis, which means I'm going to rotate my object in this direction, in the Xerly direction, if you will, right? The way to do that, of course, is you can do it manually, like we showed you before, or numerically right here if you want to be really accurate. And if I want to move, for example, 10 degrees in the X direction and press Enter, it'll actually rotate it across in a positive 10 degrees, right? Now, if you notice, how come it moved it towards me? You would think it moves it away from me in the X direction, but not so. Because the way we view X and positive and negative degrees, as an example, is positive always moves towards you. Same thing with the Y. If I moved it across Y, manipulate this 10, you'd think it's going to move. Actually, it does move in the direction you think it's going to move. And the same thing with Z. So I can physically move it across the Z location as well. So you can numeric transform as well as freeform transform your object or move around your object the way you like with the by activating the side panel with the N button. Whew. Have I killed you guys yet? There's more, right? One thing I love to do when I want to turn on different kinds of shading. Right now, multi-texture shading is really, really cool for basic rendering, but for games, it's way better to use and better from the way it reacts to use GLSL. So let's change this, shading mode from multi-texture to GLSL. What this does is it actually changes our lighting mode. You can't see a change right now, but if you notice on the bottom here, and we'll hit the next piece next day when we get together. I'll hit more of what Blender can do. We'll do a little bit of editing. Right now we're in just object mode. Right now we're just manipulating the object, right? If I press the N button again, it'll toggle away the my numeric transform screen. And on the bottom here, I'm just going to bring this mode up right here. If you notice, there's object mode. There is this right here where I can go into different kinds of different shading. Right now I'm in solid shading mode. I can go into wireframe, right? So if I want to see things in wireframe, I can also do that with the Z button. I can kind of toggle between solid and wireframe modes with the Z button. Sometimes wireframe mode is really, really important because we want to access different edges or vertices on our shape that we can't see if it's in solid mode, right? So we like to kind of look at it in wireframe mode. Okay, cool. So that's one thing it does here. Don't worry if you don't remember all these things. we're going to do them over and over again until you're sick, right? So don't worry about learning everything or remembering everything. The reason why I gave you your cheat sheet is because you can go, hey, how did Tom do that thing? Oh yeah, here it is, right? And you may want to make some notes of your own because I only cover the basics on the cheat sheet. There's different things that I just couldn't put there, right? Good to go still? All right, so let's take a look. So we did this already, and then, so this is one thing. If I go into texture mode though, texture mode actually textures it with lighting. If I click into rendered mode or material mode, I go into this materials kind of selection. If I actually have a material that's on here, it'll be rendered up here. I'm just pulling this up so you guys can see it. That's why I pulled it all the way up here, not because I want to make my screen this small. Funny, if I switch from Blender Game to Blender Render, right? And again, if I'm still here I can go from material mode into rendered mode. Rendered mode actually is when it's a simple rendering like this. Now I can still manipulate everything, but it's real-time rendering. That's what I'm doing here. So if you notice, I'm getting lighting and special effects. I can preview what the special effects is going to look like according to my current view. Right? So that's the modes I can look at things. I can go right into just the bounding box. There's my bounding box. My typical mode though is in solid mode. This is the mode that I manipulate everything from the beginning. So I think I've covered most of the basics. So let's do one quick little thing where I'm going to go a little faster. Let's press the tab button. The tab button will take us into edit mode. And let's press on the left hand side, let's press the subdivide button twice. Now I've got a bunch of these, these objects that I've subdivided a bunch of times. Let's press the A button one time to deselect everything. Now let's press Control and Tab to go into face mode, right? We're going to go over this again on Friday, don't worry. And in face mode, you see these in the middle here, you have these little dots, right? I can right-click a specific face, only that face. And if I use my manipulator arm to pull it up, I can really start molding out my object, right? Here we go. I'm going to mold out this object here. Let's try it again. I'm going to mold right-click and pull, or right-click and push, right? I can really start manipulating my object. I'm using face mode. That's what I'm doing here to right-click and push or pull my object. You can do the same thing. If I go Control-Tab and I click edge mode, now I can select an edge and I can do the same thing. I can pull and push an edge down, right? An edge. So if it's edge mode does different things than face mode. So there's three things you have to know for Blender when it comes to manipulating objects. There are faces, there are edges, there are vertices. If I go into vertex mode, let's try that out. So I'm going to go Control-Tab again, switch into vertex mode, right? And I select the vertex. Here's my vertice, right? And I can do the same thing. I can do the same manipulation. I can kind of pull this down and pull this across and pump this in, right? Or push it out and make it as sharp or as and manipulate it or change the shape of the objects as I like. Okay, cool. I want to go back, click Tab again, or press Tab again, back into Object Mode. Now press Tab again to toggle into Edit Mode. Object Mode, Edit Mode. Object Mode, Edit Mode. Object Mode is the mode we use when we play the game, or use the object in a game. Edit Mode is when we manipulate the object and change it to make it our own. If I go back into Object Mode by pressing Tab, on the left-hand side, I can click Smooth. If I click Smooth, it actually smooths out my object to make it take away some of these sharp edges, right? So that's kind of a preview of Blender. We're going to get into more objects, more types of objects, not just the cube, right? We're going to talk about spheres next time, different manipulation modes again, and we'll do a little bit of a review and a bit of a test to see if you guys can do everything by next Friday, or this Friday coming up, right? So I'm going to ask you questions, and you're going to know. I want you to know how to do it. And I'm going to pick people randomly, right? So try and fool around between now and Friday with Blender. Download it and install it on your machine at home, or your laptop if you can. Or if it's not installed in the classroom in front of you, you can certainly install it. It's not going to go away for a couple days at least, right? And check out Blender. Check out the things we talked about before. And again, you can watch the videos that I made just now, or you can always look at a ton of tutorials out there on how to make Blenders work. But I want you at the end of this course to know Blender like the back of your hand. And that's it for me.